The first standard of the nervous system covers neuron classification, and that includes the helper cells that assist neurons in carrying electrical impulses. This includes both structural support as well as physiological support. The standard reads, I can describe and classify neurons and neuroglia according to structure, function, and location, and it covers the first 5 sections of Chapter 10 in your textbook. All right, your new heading, Unit 7, the nervous system. So the nervous system has a lot of very important and critical functions. Not only does it sense the world around you and help you make decisions, but it's constantly maintaining homeostasis and controlling all of the functions that you both voluntarily and involuntarily need to carry out. The specific name for nerve cells that make up this nervous tissue is a neuron. These are the individual units of nervous tissue that are capable of receiving messages, of sending messages, and reacting to changes in the environment. The tinier cells that surround neurons, the helper cells, are called neuroglia. Okay, your first subheading, NERVE.1, neuron structure. So the cell body of a neuron, which I'm going to try to use my pen, right here, is called the soma. And that is where all the cytoplasm, all the organelles, the nucleus of this particular cell is all contained. But you'll see a lot of projections coming off of it, one of which is very special because it has this covering on it. So all of the uncovered little arms are called dendrites, and these are receptive surfaces. So if we are thinking about messages, all of these are sending messages into the soma. So messages are traveling in this direction, and that's for all of the ones here that are uncovered. The axon is this other branch, and this is the only one that carries messages away from the soma. Now, it can branch later in order to send that one message to multiple other neurons, but ultimately we're collecting a lot of information here. The soma, or the cell body, is integrating all of it and then deciding to send one comprehensive message out through the axons. This special covering here in yellow, these are individual cells called Schwann cells, which are very fatty and are kind of like flat and rolled up to create a protective covering called the myelin sheath. And given that neurons only have one axon, if that one axon gets damaged, that would completely render this cell useless. And so these helper cells are wrapped around to provide insulation as well as protection. The spaces in between the Schwann cells are called the nodes of Ranvier, and these spaces help to speed up the transmission of a message. So the message kind of hops from node to node, but we'll highlight that later in the unit. All right, we're going to classify neurons now, and we're going to first do it structurally. So by structure, neurons can be multipolar, bipolar, or unipolar. Multipolar means if you look at the cell body and you count the number of projections that are coming off of it, that you would see more than 2. Of all these projections, only one is ever the axon, and then as long as you have more than one dendrite, you're considered multipolar. Most neurons are multipolar. This is what the neuron on the previous slide looked like. This is the most common shape for a neuron. Bipolar neurons are ones that contain, again, just one axon, but also now only one dendrite. So they are receiving a singular message, and they are sending that singular message. These are really common in our sensory features, where if we're getting a message, it's just one thing. For instance, if it's in your skin, this neuron could be saying this substance is hot, or wet, or solid, or scratchy. Like, they're very one-note messages. We'll find these a lot in the eyes, ears, nose, again, sensory. The other type of neuron classification by structure is unipolar. And if there's only one process, it's an axon. But what message is this neuron sending if it didn't receive any messages? Well, usually it's because there has been some kind of pressure, physical pressure, placed on the cell, and that is the message. So these are tactile touch sensors that tell you how softly or how hard um, the pressure is in a given area. And so they send that message down the one axon. You'll notice here it looks like it could be bipolar, but it's not because the cell body itself only has one projection coming off of it. It just branches very quickly. The other way we can classify neurons is by function. We have sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. So sensory neurons exist in those sensory areas to tell the brain, to tell the central nervous system that they're getting a message. These are our uni or bipolar neurons, and their only role is to detect changes. So they detect them and they send it up to the brain. In the brain, there's a lot of interneurons, and so these are the middlemen. They're very often bipolar. They make up what's called our central nervous system, and they are the decision makers. They are the ones that decide what kind of action should be taken based on what we've sensed. So the message like swirls around in here for a little bit, and then it travels maybe to other interneurons and eventually to a motor neuron, also part of our central nervous system. This is the part of your brain that tells your muscles what to do. Sometimes they even tell glands what to do, but they basically respond to the sensory message that we received. So motor neurons are action neurons. Lastly, there are 5 specific neuroglia that I want you to be familiar with that are assisting the neuron. So this big cell right here is our neuron, and then you'll see a whole bunch of oddly shaped cells around it, each of which have a specific function. So astrocytes connect neurons to blood vessels, meaning that we don't want to have a blood vessel everywhere there's a neuron. So instead, we have these branching cells called astrocytes that are capable of shuttling oxygen to our neuron, of removing waste from the neuron and sending it to the blood, just like a lifeline to the blood vessel. Schwann cells are what I mentioned earlier. They are those flat cells that are wrapped around the axon to protect it. And again, they're very fatty, supportive cells. These Schwann cells, though, even though they're independent, are organized by cells called oligodendrocytes. So they are not part of the myelin sheath, but they exist attached to it in order to organize and support it. Along the linings of all of our nervous tissue, so lining our brain or lining our spinal cord, we have special cells called ependymal cells, which are ciliated, have those tiny protections, and serve just as a barrier, almost like an epithelial tissue for nervous cells. And then lastly, microglia are these very small mobile cells that are phagocytic, so they're walking around consuming debris, and they also continue to act as structural support because of their incredibly branched pattern. Your case study in the nervous system unit is Huntington's disease, which is one of the few autosomal dominant diseases that exist. And we'll learn more about what happens to the brain and what are the physiological changes that can be observed in someone who's suffering from Huntington's disease.